Hi, everybody. Thanks for your patience. I was having some technical difficulties trying to get into Zoom. Let's see. All right. It's good to see some familiar faces and new faces. Hi. We've still got some people coming in. All right. So while everyone's getting settled, I'm just going to review. I'm struggling to multitask here as I let people in. Just review some of our expectations for the group. So this is the Neurodiversity Affirming Consult through Holistic Child and Family in Seattle. Some of our expectations for this group are that when we introduce ourselves, we use our pronouns. So I'm Ellie, my pronouns are she, they. That we be mindful to listen to one another. We're going to be addressing intersections of race, diet culture, capitalism, sexism, homophobia, ableism. All of us are always in a process of unlearning these abusive systems and learning better ways to have these conversations. Admitting more people. So we just want to be mindful while we listen to one another and learn from one another. This meeting is being recorded and we're going to post it later. So if you want to have your video off for this portion, do whatever makes you feel most comfortable. You can participate in the conversation via chat or by speaking up, just whatever makes you feel best. And then we're going to turn the recording off before the consult part. So today our presenter is one of our therapists here at Holistic Child and Family. She's become one of our staff clinicians since she last presented. So this is Katja Downing, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Katja.
Still so surreal to be here. Hello, my name is Katja, she, her pronouns. So to preface this, here's how I'm going to structure this piece. I'm going to spend about 20, maybe 25 minutes talking. I tend to talk pretty fast because I get very excited and have a very high caffeine intake. So feel free to put a hand up or drop a note in the chat if I'm motor mouthing and you need me to slow down. I would love participation in the chat while I'm going through it, but if I attend to verbal comments while I'm presenting, we will be here until 6 p.m. And I assume that you have at least a couple other things you were going to do today. At the end, I've got a piece which is 10 to 15 minutes of discussion, skill sharing, talking about what's worked for us in our practices and our lives. And my goal is to create this document, which is going to be sent out to everyone with a mix of just practical stuff that we can do. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. Host disabled attendee screen sharing. Lovely host, I'm going to go ahead and drop a link to my Google Slides presentation in the chat. Doopity boop. Okay, copy link. Sweet. So either if host permissions could be no Zoom, do not show notifications. If host permissions could either be transferred to me or I'm going to drop a link to my presentation in the chat. Cool. I'm just going to poke you to flip slides as we go.
Sounds great. What is more comfortable with you for presenting? So I just made you co-host so you can manage your own slides, or I'm happy to do that.
Oh, got it. Let's watch me struggle with screen sharing for 30 seconds. And if that doesn't work out, then I'll transfer it back to you. Just a moment here. Okay. I feel so silly for every time. I was like, why don't professors understand how screen sharing?
It only took 5 seconds. Katja, we need your audio.
Yes, unmute. Okay, can you hear me now? It automatically disabled my audio when I flipped to the other tab. Okay, I also cannot see you when I am sharing, which means this is actually harder than I would like it to be. So I am going to stop sharing and I'm going to ask Ellie to flip my slides for me so that I don't feel like I'm yelling into the void.
Yep, I gotcha.
Thank you, Ellie. You are wonderful.
I do apologize, Katya. It wants me to sign into your Google account to share your slides. I think you're going to need to share them.
Okay, no biggie, no biggie. We got this. Okay. My audio might go out again. Here we go. Okay. No, we are not sharing tab audio. Share? Yes. Is this working? Do we still have audio?
Yes,
Yes,
we're
we
good.
do.
Thank you. Okay. I am losing the visual of stuff in the chat and your faces when I'm in it. So like, please unmute yourselves and holler at me if you need to.
And
Okay.
I'll monitor chat for anyone that doesn't want to pop in and talk.
Excellent. Beautiful. Thank you. So autism-friendly counseling. So to start, I'd like us to kind of take a moment, like, 10 to 30 seconds, and just think about what's worked for you in your counseling experiences, both giving and receiving. So what positive associations do you have? What helped? What didn't feel so good? What hurt? And what did you learn? So one of the reasons I'm asking this early on is because one of the things that studies consistently show us is that common factors like rapport, the therapeutic alliance, pretty much how well you get along with your therapist is one of the primary factors in how well we do. And a lot of the time when we're thinking about positive therapy experiences, I know I think about things like cracking jokes with my therapist or their body language. What I'm not thinking about is their efficacy at writing fear ladders and using like these implemented structured things. So a lot of this presentation is going to be talking about CBT because it is the gold standard of therapy. I've included this opinion article just because it is genuinely very funny to me how many times they managed to use the word gold standard in 2 paragraphs. The rest of this article is actually kind of critical of CBT as the gold standard and introduces some arguments for a more multidisciplinary lens. But for the most part, a lot of the time when we're talking about evidence-based practices, we're talking about CBT. But what does that actually look like for autistic populations? So here is a 2018 study in which providers were surveyed on things that came up when working with autistic clients, challenges and stuff that was different. So the language in this piece is not the most affirming. It was people who were doing their best, but might not have had all the resources that we're trying to create here. The number one thing that we see is rigidity or black and white thinking. So CBT is focused on changing thought patterns, and that is, as it turns out, kind of difficult when part of your diagnostic criteria is you think what you think. We also see other stuff like pacing. So here I'm seeing some kind of executive stuff, difficulty concentrating, difficulty with written skills, learning after client dropped out that I perhaps needed to take things slower. Communication issues and literal use of language. So a tendency to take things literally and in a concrete way. I know I've definitely had moments, especially with smaller kids, where I use a metaphor and they ask me what I mean. And I'm like, right, nope, that was nonsense, might be. From here, we also get problems with the therapeutic relationship. So harder to engage, socially anxious within the therapeutic relationship. In the context of autism, that one makes a lot of sense to me. One of the main strategies that I see people using in order to perform in social situations is mirroring, matching what people around you are doing. It gets real weird when you do that in therapy. Like, as a social situation, therapy is really anomalous, where it is supposed to be somewhat one-sided. It is supposed to be one person being asked questions and one person asking more. And when you have all these experiences of social rejection or a feeling like you're a little bit different, like, yeah, anxiety makes all the sense in the world, especially with how self-disclosure is a big topic. But when clinicians are trained, what's up? Okay, I thought I heard a beep. When clinicians are trained to avoid self-disclosure and they're presenting that kind of blank wall, if your primary strategy is mirroring, you're going to have a really challenging time. We've also got adapting or including written materials, so using pictures to explain concepts or needing time to adapt written resources. And as we go on, this is the rest of the table. We see these things that result with, these things come up with kind of like diminishing frequency over here, where we're only seeing 2 of the attendees reported not completing homework versus 20 reported rigidity in thinking. But all of this feels pretty familiar to me. So we see stuff like difficulty recognizing and understanding emotions. I mean, geez, with reduced interoception, masking, and I am blanking really hard on the word. But the thing where a lot of us do struggle to identify our own emotions, like a lot of the framework of therapy that therapists come into isn't going to be, that foundation is shaky. Finally, down here, we've got stuff like co-occurring problems and problem identification. Differentiating between anxiety relating to ASD that the client does not want to address and anxiety getting in the way of them living their life in the way they want. I genuinely don't know what that respondent means by that. It sounds like they think that those should feel like two different anxieties, but a lot of us have complex humans. It's kind of hard being autistic and not being complex. It's kind of hard being a human and not being complex. Difficulties generalizing can sometimes seem quite compliant, but then not actually take the ideas forward. To me, that reads like mirroring again. A lot of us are trained to perform compliance from a very young age. Systemic factors, having to manage parental stresses, everybody's favorite. You've got pressures from parents, schools, or other systems asking why you're not seeing behavior changes or why it doesn't seem like therapy is working. When you're over here like, I'm really just trying to have a relationship. And then finally, not completing homework, homework not done, and sensory issues, getting overwhelmed by noises and light. So I'm going to flip back over to the group for a minute because it feels weird yelling into the void. For me, a lot of this stuff feels really familiar. It feels really familiar with the diagnostic criteria and with just the experiences of what it means to be autistic in the world. So where do we go from here? I'm going to address that in a couple minutes, but first I'm going to complain a little bit more. So here is another thing which complicates working with autistic humans. So trauma. So this was a study of a pool of autistic clients who had clinically significant responses on a measure of PTSD symptoms. But researchers wanted to know whether like kind of standard traumas were really covering everything that was resulting in this PTSD. So per the DSM, they've actually got this very narrow definition of trauma: death, injury, violence, exposure to it, fear of it, etc. And what we see with this specific pool of autistic people is, yeah, that does come up. We have a lot of items on those traditional PTSD scales, which we are seeing autistic people experiencing and resulting in trauma from. But then when we turn the questions to the group, so I believe the question that the researcher asked in this particular 2020 study was something along the lines of, have there been other events which have resulted in marked distress, or there was kind of a change after them that you did not see reflected on those scales? And suddenly we see this wide range of things. Bullying comes up a lot. We see that so much with our kids. People being traumatized by their own mental health. People being traumatized by the ASD diagnostic process. Own violence to other. What really sticks out to me is that there seems to be kind of a bigger focus on more shame related things. So over here we see like, these are things that happened to me. These are things that happened to me from an outside force. But over here on these non-DSM traumas, these are things that tell me that I'm bad. My wife abandoned me. Psychological therapy comes up as a trauma. Police visits to house. To me, what this really speaks to is how steeped in shame a lot of us really are. And obviously that's not just limited to autistic folks, but with autistic folks, it's a different range of shames and stressors. And then finally, we got a meta-analysis from 2021. I love meta-analyses. They're one of my favorite kinds of study because they look at so many different kinds of data. And CBT has been very, 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 very researched. So there was a lot of data to choose from. And what they found is that, yeah, CBT is a little helpful. You know, it can alleviate some anxiety in autistic kids, but clinicians and caregivers report a way stronger effect than the kids themselves, which also makes me wonder if kids are being kind of coached into saying the things which are going to alleviate their caregivers' anxiety. And there is some reporting bias. You know, assuming good intentions, we want the people we love to succeed, but also if we're trying to support them in ways that don't work for them, put some not great pressure on them. And this effect doesn't necessarily last long term. So in some of the follow-ups, we found that this effect on anxiety was sort of temporary. But the real big thing with CBT, and this comes up with any oppressed population, whether you're talking about sexual, racial, gender minorities, immigrants, autistic people, whatever, is that a lot of what might be identified as a distortion is literally what is happening in real life right now. So somebody saying, I can't do that. That's too hard for me. I can't do that. Like a traditional CBT response might be like, well, how about we look at how that belief of I can't do that is impacting your life? And you're over here like, I am telling you, I can't do that. If I do that, my life will be worse. I need to find something else. So one thing that we talk about is reading can'ts as won'ts, or reading won'ts as can'ts. A lot of the time, an autistic person will identify a can't, and it'll be read as a won't. It'll be read as a question of attitude or compliance rather than literal ability. And then, especially here, we've got anxiety about social situations or being disliked. Everybody hates me. People take advantage of me. My boss is really mean to me. um, we might perceive those as false beliefs. We might perceive those as the anxiety talking, but also show me somebody who's in an environment where everybody genuinely does express a lot of displeasure around them, and show me someone who does not develop anxiety or depression in that environment. Like a lot of the time, the emotions are a response to the environment that we're in, not to the beliefs that we have. A lot of the time, when oppressed people identify things about their environments, they're read as beliefs. And I mean, that's just gaslighting in the long term. At the end of the day, you can't CBT somebody into being okay with oppression. It just doesn't work like that. Like, you can't see the silver lining of being oppressed. So, what do we do instead? Well, one of the things we can do is work with the brain in front of you. So, here's that same study which surveyed providers who are trying to do CBT with autistic populations. And here were some of the interventions that they reported using. So, behavioral strategies to introduce change as opposed to cognitive ones, using plain English more than with other clients, a more structured and concrete approach. This is going to be sent out to you. I know that the font is pretty small, especially if you're joining on a phone, but there's some pretty solid concrete stuff in here. To take it a little further, auditory processing is rough, support with written materials or visuals, or in general, having a couple of different ways to make the point that you want to make. Yeah, stating it's good. Yeah, writing it's good. But stating it, writing it, having a picture, and having a visual reminder, awesome. Executive function. Homework might go undone. Also, like, I mean, if homework goes undone, that tells me that maybe it's not the most helpful, or maybe that there's something else that we need to attend to. You can work with pacing rather than seeing it as a question of compliance. Info dumping. To go back to that social anxiety within the therapeutic relationship, talking about special interests can be a beautiful point of connection. Talking about special interests is one of my love languages. I was very uncomfortable at a party a few months ago, and I met somebody who was really into clothing, and I received a very nice lecture on the different ways that we dye wool and the effects that it has on the fabric it generates. Like, that was lovely. Rather than seeing that as, why are they talking about this rather than talking about therapy? Like, they're trying to build a relationship with you. They're reaching out to you and saying, I really like this thing. And you can be like, yeah, that thing's awesome. Tell me more about it. And then social anxiety, hypervigilance, and mirroring. How do we get around that when it's so baked in? So one thing that I found helpful is labeling your own thoughts and experiences. Talking about shared expectations in the beginning, like, this is how it's going to go, here's how I'm going to structure sessions, creating room for like feedback and pushback, giving options. Is it useful for us to be talking about this, or do you want to talk about this other thing, or is there a different thing on your mind? And naming how different therapy is from other social stuff, where like the same strategies that you use in an unfamiliar social environment might not be the most helpful in therapy, but there's a reason that you develop them. So what I really like is looking under the hood, putting the inside on the outside, rather than just being this black box, which is just like the face of processing. Establishing yourself as another human in relation to the human in front of you. We've also developed some pretty rad tools here. So I've credited Ellie with this one from their amazing presentation. Late last year, this graphic was created by Marie's kiddo Zuzu. Shout out to Zuzu. I have added a little cartoon roller coaster cart because this always looks like a roller coaster to me. But one thing we talk about a lot is the escalation cycle, which helps us identify when we're in a place to make plans, to make changes. So this is a physiological process. So you're trucking along in your baseline green zone, you're having a regular day, and then some triggers kick in. Everybody's triggers are different. You might be able to identify a couple of your own right now. I know that rejection, unclear expectations, sensory overwhelm, I get really affected by body sensations. So if I'm like under rested or tired, I know I'm at a reduced capacity. And surprises tend to be really hard. So having to readjust. We start going up into our yellow zone. Whenever I think about going up into the yellow zone, I picture the noise that a roller coaster makes as it starts going up that track onto the rest of the coaster, that kind of like chung, 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 chung noise. We might notice physiological sensations there. It might be easier to identify cognitive processes. So noticing like a lot of us process stuff with daydreams, we might notice that the content of our daydreams change when we're starting to feel escalated versus when we're at baseline. And those physiological activation symptoms, so sweaty palms, heart starting to pick up, sensory stuff getting harder to tolerate. There's certain shirts that I can't wear when I'm stressed out because the sensory aspect of them is rough when I'm not doing so good. And if we're continuing up that escalation, if we don't get a chance to get off the roller coaster, which I recognize is not a standard part of the roller coaster experience, but if we don't get a chance to get off the roller coaster, we end up in our red zone. We end up in crisis. And crisis is usually going to look like one of our survival strategies. So fight, flight, freeze, fawn, submit, and destroy. We can broadly group them into kind of like red versus blue or hot versus cold crisis. You might be able to picture these off the top of your head. So like somebody who's like yelling or breaking things or sobbing uncontrollably or like moving around a lot versus somebody who's like freezing, can't talk, can't think, can't breathe, might feel really cold physically. The thing about being in crisis is you don't do a lot of thinking here. That's not what it's about. Crisis is when you are in survival mode. There is no past, there is no future. It's just present, and the present feels really bad. We can't be in crisis forever. It's like sprinting a marathon. Our body can't hold on to that much activation forever. So after a while, it lets go, and we end up in this kind of post-crisis gray zone. So you might feel that kind of like depressed or low energy, that kind of cognitive slowness, the headache from crying. Planning, also not great here. Like over here, we were in survival mode. Over here, we are in recovery from survival mode. So the things that tend to pull us out of crisis tend to be stuff that's soothing and feels nice, stuff like predictability, low sensory environments, taking it easy, getting love and reassurance from the people who give us love and reassurance. So the same things that can bring us back to baseline after that crisis can also help us get off the roller coaster if we notice that we're on it. When we start noticing that activation, we start noticing that escalation, we can be like, hey, hold up. I know where this goes. I know how this ride plays out. I'm going to take a step back. I'm going to ask for what I need from the people around me. I'm going to take care of myself. And I'm going to like take a moment to regulate. Sometimes the people around us, lovingly and with the best of intentions, end up kind of pushing us more when we're in the yellow zone. So talking about like a little kiddo who's starting to melt down, you can picture like an anxious adult around them being like, what do you need? What do you need? What do you want? And they're like, ah, and they go up into the red zone. Giving people space, like actual space and ability to express what they need, super helpful. And being able to think about this while you're in your green zone, also super helpful. Because again, planning, straight up not really an option here and not the funnest when you're here. Planning really wants to live in the green zone. One of the other things that we talk about at Holistic Child and Family is empathetic inquiry. Shout out to Ellie again for this amazing graphic. So empathetic inquiry is about making sense of what you're seeing in front of you. And like understanding your client's logic, not just assuming that they're irrational or mentally ill. Like it always makes sense if you have access to the same data that your client does. So you start with a triggering event, and the triggering event prompts thoughts, knowledge, feelings, and senses, this whole process. And that results in an action. And when you have the context of the thoughts, knowledge, feelings, and senses that your client is coming in with, usually their responses are going to make a lot of sense to you. If something isn't making sense, that indicates that there's more data that you might not have. Maybe data that the person in front of you doesn't realize you don't have. So like if a seemingly small thing results in a seemingly disproportionate reaction, there's more stuff going on than you might see. So Marie always uses the example. Marie, do you want to state your example? Because you tell this story very beautifully.
Sure. So I had a teenager come into the emergency department who didn't do well on a test, or he thought that he failed the test. And then he had a little logic train where I failed a test. I'm more impacted by my autism than I thought I was. The only other person that I know who's autistic lives in an institution. That is not the kind of quality of life I'd like to have. I'd rather be dead. And so he went to the neighboring chemistry lab and swallowed some chemicals. So coming into this space, he had already been seen by doctors who had some understanding of just sort of more of a paternalistic approach of how the parents can keep him safe and having more eyes on in the school. But my approach was to say, yeah, that logic train makes 100% sense based upon the knowledge that you had, based upon what was happening internally for you, based upon like what you thought things meant. I can see that that made you really dysregulated and feel like this was your only option. So the intervention that we did was first charting his escalation cycle, which includes like, you know, what you can do to feel better, but also what do you want other people to do to help you feel better? And it included who can we ask for more data? So really just like removing any sort of morality from it and just saying with the data that you had, that is a logical conclusion. How can we recognize when we need more data and bring that in?
Thank you, Marie. That was rad. Yeah, the morality lens is huge. One of the things that I find myself thinking is like, man, I'm not here to judge if you're a good or bad person. Like, I'm just here to see how stuff is working out for you. It's so many clients seem to like kind of lie down and expect to get run over with the shame Zamboni. And I'm over here like, no, that makes sense. It's all good. Let's find some other places where we can sort of push on stuff. Like, I'm not asking you to fundamentally change as a person. That's not actually a workable intervention here. So the last thing I got for you today is a skill share. I know that a lot of us come into this with experience, and like, I'm sure that there's some people who's like, yes, I have this thing, I want to share it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop a link in the chat to a different presentation, which is mostly blank. What that presentation is, sorry, not going to multitask. Should have learned by now. Here we go. Ooh, okay. This is obviously purely optional, but if you have stuff that you want to share, if you have stuff that you think other people could benefit from, let me stop sharing this and start sharing a different thing. Come on, here we go.
Your sound is gone again.
Okay, thank you for letting me know. For some reason, it automatically shares the audio from the tab, but there is no audio from the tab. Okay, let's try this again. Oop. No share to tab audio. Okay, what you can see is a pretty blank slideshow with the same headings as were identified in that table of challenges in doing CBT with autistic clients at the beginning. Each of these, if you've got something that's like, hey, for rigidity and thinking, I like to understand where my client is coming from and attune that makes sense. For pacing, I like to check in with my client that I am taking things at a pace that makes sense and to chunk stuff up that it feels more digestible. Communication challenges, attuning to the way that your client talks. If you have ideas, concrete suggestions, stuff that you want other people to know, please feel free to write it in. But also feel free to sit back and watch if that works better for you. So
yeah, there's a question in the chat. Is this something we are working on right now or later?
This is something that you have the option of working on right now. I've budgeted about 10 minutes for 10 to 15 minutes for discussion and Skillshare, but you also are very welcome to do it later today. That link isn't going away. Yeah. So now I'd kind of like to turn it to the group. Like, what have you seen in your experiences with autistic clients? What's worked for you? What hasn't worked for you? What comes up with this? And I'm going to stop sharing.
I want to start. Katya, you're amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your time. Like,
I totally identified because a couple months ago when I did my presentation, like I had tech issues too. So I was like, oh girl, I hear you. But I guess I wanted to clarify of the questions. I really am excited for this, the slides that we're going to share. But so what is kind of your main point that autistic people really need a blended therapeutic style, right? Like taking what we know from, is that what I'm hearing from you? Is that like, it's super important to take like our ideas and understanding as therapists, but blend it and make it affirming?
Hard yes. I'm actually
Okay,
really
I
confused
understood.
how many out here doing therapy without a blended approach. Like, how does that work?
Well, I agree, but there's always a part of me that's like, oh my God, I'm not doing what I think I should be doing. But like hearing your presentation today just made me realize, like, when I bring in my own unique style, and I like to now say that I neuroqueer my practice and I neuroqueer my my interventions and stuff, it just seems like that means that we are meeting them where they're at. So
Yes.
thank you so much. I just wanted to clarify, make sure I understood.
No, I love that. It like I hadn't said that explicitly, but you are absolutely right. A blended approach is we have all these tools at our disposal. Why wouldn't we use them?
I will just jump in that one of the things that I do a lot is to democratize the information. And so you talked about like having more psychoed. I'm so huge on psychoed. People say like, when I say, oh, research shows this, and like, send me the study. Like, I know where that's coming from because I'm exactly the same way. And I don't take offense. But I know from clients that they've been to other providers where that was offensive, or that was taken in a defensive or offensive way. And then the other thing is that, like, when it comes to something like navigating the medical model, I just tell them, here's what your insurance requires that we do in the first session. I have to give you a diagnosis. We can just do adjustment disorder while we figure it out. Here's the DSM. I think you might meet criteria for this. Let's go over this together. How does that feel for me to say that this is a diagnosis that maybe I would give you? And just like making everything, like trying to take the power out of it and help like understand like why we're doing things and giving them options. So like in using different modalities, I will just say like for trauma, here's what a trauma narrative sort of generally is, and here's this other, modality and how to address trauma, and here's this other one, and which one aligns with you the most, and what do you want to do? And if I am not like super great at that, I will acknowledge that and say, I'm happy to like do a training and learn more about that, or I can make a referral to somebody else that can do this very specific thing. But really, because again, it's just about that relationship. Like they're like, yeah, thank you for being so open and willing to learn ways that maybe would feel better for me.
I love that so much. On the kind of flip side of that experience, when I was in my psychology undergrad, I worked with a therapist who would get irritated with me whenever I used psychology terminology. And I'm like, but this is what's happening. Like I am experiencing a marked increase in anxiety. Like letting people express themselves the way that they want to. And yeah, absolutely leveling those power dynamics, giving them access to the same tools that we have.
I'll just jump in here if that's okay. So I'm autistic, and thank you so much for what you're presenting, because it was just, I was vibing with the whole presentation. So thank you. One of the things that you said, which is something that I absolutely do, is I bring in special interests. I do everything through teletherapy. And so sometimes I want them to share with me their screens, and they show me what they're interested in. They explain why it's so important to them. And then I riff off of that. Sometimes, perfect example, I don't know if anybody is a Doctor Who fan, but I will take the characters in that, genre, that fandom, and then say, okay, well, the master is kind of like your anxiety right now. And so I'm using those tools that they're giving me. And that's been just fantastic. And also, similar to Marie, I democratize things and say, yeah, you're right. The way that this world is doesn't work for us. So let's find your solutions. And we're going to go with you being the expert in this. So.
It's like aloe vera for the soul, hearing you talking about like, let's use your solutions and like, let's treat you as the expert. We're like, especially with the services that we see really small kids receiving. A little while before this call, I was talking to somebody who works with a lot of ABA providers. I know that that's its own whole thing. Yeah. But just like with the way that we see kind of this compliance being trained into people from a really young age, being able to break through that, oh God, it's a paradigm shift. And yes, special interest is a point of connection. I have learned so much about Minecraft over the past few months. Also, I agree, there should be a TARDIS emoji.
I was literally just typing that. And then I was also just saying like, yeah, Whovian, absolutely. Use that in sessions all the time. And I really got stuck and I decided just to talk because it kept auto-correcting when I was trying to write wibbly wobbly timey wimey. But it's like one of the things that that we often talk about with my clients is like, we don't experience time, like linear progression of time in the same way. And so what does it feel like when you feel like all of your ages at the same time? Of like, you know, when we try to put it into language, sometimes it's like, oh, I feel like a child and a really old person all at the same time. But like, that's language that like I've created based upon how I understand neurotypicals explaining time progression to me. And how can we create that for ourselves? And then how can we integrate into a world that's so like specifically interested in linear time progression that doesn't always make sense to us. So anyway, love that you're a Whovian, delighted that you use that in therapy.
Something that I have been finding myself using a lot is asking how my clients are, like literally asking how they're defining something, which I think kind of like bridges communication issues and rigid thinking sometimes, because then I can be like, can I provide some additional context for like why other people might have a different definition, or what like therapeutically or clinically how that's usually defined, and I'll give them like a couple different types of ways to define that. Like on Tuesday, I was talking with a client about like what it means to be nonverbal or selectively mute, because they do not want to describe themselves as nonverbal for fear of like offending people. But they shut down verbally when they start getting escalated. And so we talked about like, you can use that if that's the word that makes sense to you. Like, this is why other people might not feel that way, or like why not allistic people might say that that means only autistic people who never speak out loud, and how that's not necessarily accurate or even like really the accepted thing in the autism community. So yeah, that's one that I use a lot that kind of bridges them.
What I really love about that is it sounds like you're pulling in additional data. I listened to a podcast about how dictionaries are written, and dictionaries are written based on the way that people use words, which is why the term literally no longer literally means literally. Sometimes it means for emphasis, or not literally. And it's like a lot of the time when we see a word, it's like, no, there's a right and a wrong definition. Like there's this authority, which is the holder of words, and this means that. You're taking the more like subjective and data gathering approach, which is like, well, here's how some people use it, here's how others use it, here's where I'm seeing some like where maybe some like confusion might arise, but like this makes sense.
Yeah, I really words that have always stuck in my mind are like connotation and denotation. And so like I teach those words to my clients so that they can tell the difference between like what the like technical definition of something is and the social definition of something is. And I find that to be really helpful.
And I'm doing my best to keep up in the slides and like drop in answers as you're naming them.
So I realized that when I was speaking, I forgot to say my pronouns, they and she, and I'm Marie. I just wanted to also share the normalizing and a lot of self-disclosure. I know when we had Matt Lowry do a presentation, he talked about that autistic therapists tend to have more self-disclosure than allistic or neurotypical therapists, which I found to be like, I've just been really reflecting on the use of that, and having just more curiosity when I'm in a therapeutic space. And I will say that I think it's a huge shift for my clients. From when I used to have not any disclosure. I felt like I had to pick, am I somebody who is autistic with autistic children, or am I a clinician? And that really impacted my ability to be a whole person in that space. And also, I just don't feel like I think my approach was more like analytical and less grounded in experience. And so knowing how to have both of those things together, and also just name my synesthesia. So if I'm in a room with somebody and they are experiencing a strong emotion that they're not, like manifesting as affect, I will feel it in my body. So sometimes I will have tears come out of my face, or I will have like a pit in my stomach. And so being able to say, this is how my neurodiversity presents, and this is giving me a clue into maybe how you're feeling, and what are also like the ways that you interact with the world that might be slightly different, helps with just like early interoception of like, we don't need to shut all of this down. If we're overwhelmed by the world, we can know how to like navigate the world. And so a lot of people have shared that me using myself as an example has been really affirming, that they know that they could function at a different level in the future once they sort of understand themselves better.
One of the things I notice about that is it like creates the model where like talking about feelings is this very abstract thing where like not everybody experiences the same physiological sensations, and a lot of us are really tuned out of that. We know that for ADHD and autism, it's a lot easier to do the thing if you have an example of what it's supposed to look like at the end, and you're demonstrating that.
It's an amazing point. And I was just going to follow up with, I have clients, because I disclose a lot too, and I used to have a lot of shame about that. But the more that we talk about how neurodivergent people, that's how we grow that support. I've had clients, when I tell them my meltdown stories, or just using myself as an example, they'll go, okay, I always saw you as this like standard for like this perfection. And like when I normalize it, I go, no, like I have knowledge about mental health. It doesn't mean that I have amazing mental health. It means that I'm a human. And like just even recognizing that like there isn't a perfection there. There isn't something that you need to strive to. It's just understanding yourself and loving yourself. And when I can share some of my like ridiculous stories about my real life, I have found that then they'll go, oh, and this would happen with me. And then they share more, or it really helps them feel more normal.
Yeah, one of my favorite moments, like one of my favorite self-disclosures to bring up in, especially in the context of people who are experiencing a lot of shame for like not reacting appropriately to a surprise, is once it just straight up threw off my entire day because someone poured my coffee for me. Where like, I'm supposed to wake up, I go to the kitchen, I make my coffee, I go back to my bedroom, and I scroll through my phone while drinking my coffee, and no one interacts with me. And then on this day, that was suddenly turned into a social interaction where I had to express gratefulness that I was not actually feeling. And that really threw a wrench into the entire day. And you can just see like the tension melt out of the shoulders when they're like, oh gosh, I'm not the only one.
Something else that I've been working with some clients on, also, I forgot to mention my pronouns and stuff. I'm Asia, pronouns they, she, is that I have some clients right now who are really into their smartwatches. And so one thing, yeah, and so we were talking about if we could figure out a way to make it alert the client to when their heart rate is escalating so that they can tell in a conflict if they need to step away, because we're trying to figure out like, do you need to like write your side of this, or do you need to have some space to think about your words, because they shut down so severely and start people pleasing immediately. And so we were like, oh, well, we literally can gather some data about when this is happening so that it buzzes and it alerts you, and you can be like, oh, this is when I start to shut down. I got to walk away for a minute.
I had a friend who was literally working on an app to do something similar, though for them it's tracking panic attacks, but like the physiological symptoms are going to be the same. I'm really excited. I think we're a couple years away from that, and then from receiving targeted ads based on when and how you have breakdowns, but that's neither here nor there.
I'm going to add on, and again, if you don't mind. So I also forgot my pronouns, she, her. And one of the things that really affects me is sensory information. So a lot of my clients, when they are dysregulated, and they come in and they're talking about their dysregulation, and they don't know why they reacted, I can start to say, well, what was going on in your environment that added to this? And then again, that piece of telling my own story, I can't go to the store if I don't have, the earplugs in, or I may need sunglasses if I'm going to a place where there's light that's too bright. And so having that sense of the understanding of how the environment itself is impactful has been just really healing. And also I do the thing where I say, are you screaming inside? And that really resonates with people, because there's this idea that you can't speak it, you can't exhibit it in the world, but are you screaming inside with all of the stuff that's happening for you outside?
Yes, 100%. And like the thing that sticks out to me about screaming inside is if it's really loud up here, other stuff is going to not get done as well. Like, how am I supposed to do math if there's a bunch of screaming in my head? Yeah.
Katya, I was just wondering if you could share a little bit about the sensory options that are in our offices, just as examples.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you. Would you want to share that about our offices?
Sure. So all of our fluorescent lighting has covers to diffuse them with sort of pictures that are with themes. We have different themed rooms because I'm a nerd and I like that. But we have like some traditional therapeutic spaces that are just stocked with fidgets and other things. But then we also have just like a gross motor room with yoga balls and some other things. And we have a room that's sort of like lower stem beanbag proprioceptive room that people can like really figure out like what space they feel best in to be able to regulate their nervous system and reduce the physiological impact of their stressors so that they can actually communicate with us. And the amount of like agency that they've gotten has just been amazing. I had somebody who's on our floor took a tour and showed me her space. And I was like, well, your space is like very grown up. And she's like, yeah, but you work with little kids. And I was like, no, I don't. We just work with neurodivergent people and we're autistic. And it feels good to have a weighted blanket and a beanbag. And it's just like people just hadn't, there's a lot of therapists on the floor hadn't thought about that adults maybe would want to do something different than sit on a couch.
So I might have screamed a little with excitement when you said all of that. That is my dream. I'm probably a little bit too passionate about this right now. I've been going on this whole kick, but I work with teens and adults transitioning more to adults, and there is so much sensory stuff for kids. But then when you get to adults, it's like nobody has sensory needs anymore. So, I have been looking for a long time just for adult sensory stuff and just looking to normalize it. And I actually started creating my own handouts and all of that because I just got frustrated with how few. I'm happy to share them. They're not completely done, but I'm wondering if you guys have anything you do to normalize sensory needs, or if you have really, I just put together a list of exercises and did like yoga ball and weights. But this is something I've been spending many, many hours looking into and making resources. So if anyone wants to join me or give me more information, I would love.
I found it's,
No, you go ahead. I was just saying that one of the things is we have like I found a free sensory checklist to just sort of like get a baseline of what is something that you're adverse to and something that you're seeking. And then we all just like normalize it here. But like I have thinking putty right beside me and we have fidgets like in every room. But we can like make sure that we share the resources that we have with everybody, because it feels really hard to normalize it for adults. And I'm sorry, Ellie.
oh, you're fine. I was just going to say that I found when I start to unmask and stem more or be more authentic in sessions, it's really inviting for clients because it's super vulnerable to ask somebody who's been highly masked because of the systems in place to unmask if I'm masked. So when I'm able to start moving my body more or using a fidget, I see clients feeling more comfortable to do that too.
And identifying the stuff that we do as fidgets, where it's like, you know, I'm that stereotype of I'm switching in my chair, I'm throwing a leg over the back, I end up in a handstand because my body's got a wiggle. And like, you'll see me put my hair up and take it down 80 times a day. Also, I'm seeing a hand up from Emily.
Hi, I'm Emily, she, they pronouns. Yeah, this has been really wonderful to hear everyone's ideas. I think for me, communication, I think was one of the slides up there. And I just think like check-ins with who I'm working with to see where they're at, and I will like kind of share my perspective, like, hey, I really like check-ins. How does this feel? Like, are you staying? We've talked about this so far and made a plan for this, but how are you feeling about that right now? I think just check-ins has provided a tool for both of us to really just model, like, I have sensory needs I'm trying to meet. I have things going on that I'm trying to meet, and things change, and that's okay. And providing that space. And then another tool that I use for communication is whole, part, whole. Like whole, this is kind of the big thing we're talking about. Part, this is one of the parts to it. And then back to whole, how that will shape us and feel better. And I feel like that just makes it a little more manageable than having to focus on the whole all the time, or really going into narrowly on a part. And then another communication tool is just modeling advocacy and just labeling what I'm doing. Like, oh yeah, I am gonna stand up and walk around right now because I need to move. And I think like just labeling it and modeling it on myself just really helps them, one, be maybe aware of it and themselves on a way that maybe they were or were not, or at least it be more comfortable with. And I just think for me, I feel more comfortable of being like, I know me and I'm going to talk about me before just like jumping in to be like, oh, I noticed you're fidgeting. Like maybe someone's like, yeah, like I don't need you to tell me that though, you know? So those are just some tools I was thinking of.
I love that. I've got those all up on the communication slide. I love the whole, part, whole idea as well, where it's like making room for both aspects of the thing and the overarching structure. I'm also seeing some beautiful stuff in the chat here. Would it be helpful to read it out loud? What would work best for humans?
I could share a couple of thoughts that I had. So I'm Carice, my pronouns are she, her. And like, I'm just really enjoying hearing about all of these things that I've done that have maybe gotten me a little bit in trouble is in graduate school with my supervisors who were more by the book, who are used to working with neurotypical, you know, children, adults, parents, where they don't have to think creatively and they don't have to work hard to get to know their person and what works for them. So when I'm thinking about communication, I think what Emily said made me think of this is I like to use like scavenger hunts or collages, like take a camera, watch a favorite show, do some drawing, like what do people associate with their big feelings? Like, is it a person? Is it a place? Like, can we use those images, colors, words, screenshots, like favorite book scenes or whatever it is, and use that as a way to kind of build that understanding and share and model kind of jointly. And then so it's so strange that therapists don't have more sensory supports, because it's not just, you know, autism and other neurodevelopmental conditions. People with anxiety have a lot of sensory needs. PTSD, there's a lot of sensory needs. Like there's so many reasons why you should have a sensory friendly environment for all sorts of people with all of their needs. So it always like blows my mind. And I just bought a heated weighted laptop. Things could happen simultaneously, and I haven't gotten it yet. I'm super excited. But yeah, it's like a little heated lap pad, but then I found out they also come in weighted and heated. So it's like a little electric blanket for your lap that can weigh either 2 or 4 pounds. So like I can totally put that link in the chat. I see lots of excited faces, and I wanted to share that with you because I am also excited. We also have these cool walks in our office, which I'm enjoying. So I'm loving like all of the ideas, and I'm wondering if we could like make a slide in this Skillshare about like what are your favorite like purchases for yourself or your clients, so that we can all like share our favorite things. I'll do that because I'm always looking for good lamps, good fidgets, like places to look for things. So
First off, my inner cat self would never be out from under a heated weighted lap pad. Second off, I had a miscellaneous slide, but it was super vague and there was no writing on it. So I've switched that to a favorite purchases, like items page. You also identified something that I was thinking really loudly, but completely forgot to verbalize during this, which is the stuff that works for autistic clients also helps other people in the same way that wheelchair ramps help people with strollers or people who are recovering from foot surgery, or kneeling buses, or visual aids just makes classrooms more interesting. Like the same interventions that we design because other stuff isn't working also makes it easier for clients who other stuff does work for. Like there's really no downside here.
Been interesting because I've done some crisis management, like working with first responders, that like having sunglasses around and easy to access can really help somebody who's coming, you know, who's post-ictal, coming out of a seizure with light sensitivity. Headphones are really good for people who may be struggling to kind of concentrate and attend. So there's lots of like uses to like sensor, like I'm excited to add some more things to my like list of stuff I can make an excuse to buy.
Carice, you asked about fidget pets, and this one's one of them, and his ears move and he has a little button nose and his feet spin and it makes a satisfying clicking sound. I also have a monkey who has a popper on his butt, and you pop it back out with his ears and his tail moves his eyes. I also have a snake with a really fun tongue, and he's like all twisty and stuff. And so they're awesome.
That is so cute. I really appreciate everyone just sharing. And I'm super excited about, oh yeah, Britt.
I just one more comment. I'm sorry. One thing that I think could be really helpful is when I have a new client, I like to talk about what they think a therapy session should look like, or what they think a therapy client should look like, because they'll just like mask their butts off, right? So, that could be a good way to talk about sensory stuff, is I'll start off by saying like, there is no right or wrong way to therapy. There's no right or wrong way. And I'll say, here's what I do. Like, I'll show them my candle. I need a candle burning, and I'll say I'll have fidgets all over. And like, so just kind of first and foremost, like saying what are the expectations of therapy? What do you think the expectations of therapy are? And like just eliminating the social confusion, because it is ultimately a social interaction, and that can really help, because then you can say, here's what I do for my sensory, and feel free to do whatever you want. Like actually 2 nights ago, I had a really tough day, and my last session client, I just kind of said, do you mind if I color during this session? I really need it. And it definitely helped me to like just be, I think it's kind of rude to be like on markers and I'm looking down more than if I am with a fidget, but she totally understood, and she's like, oh my God, yes, right, feel free. And by even me, and she even said, like, I could see that when you came to session you were dysregulated, and it was like it communicated to her, I'm going to do this to take care of myself, and I'm going to tell you what I'm doing. And then by the end, right, she's like, I can definitely tell that you're in a better place. I'm like, yeah, because I colored. So anyway.
I love this. Katya, thank you so much for sharing, and thank you for creating this resource for us. I'm really excited to see it grow. We are going to transition over to our case consultation. So I'm going to stop recording